In 2022, one of America's most famous sauces began disappearing. Supermarket shelves stood empty, restaurants rationed their remaining bottles, and online, a sauce that normally cost only a few dollars was being resold for astonishing prices. The factory behind the famous green-capped bottle could no longer secure enough red jalapeño peppers. Drought and poor harvests were blamed, but the crisis revealed something deeper. A global icon had become dangerously dependent on a fragile supply chain. Yet Sriracha did not begin in America. Its story started in a coastal town in Thailand, passed through the hands of a Vietnamese refugee, and became one of the most recognizable sauces in the world. How did a simple chili sauce conquer the globe and nearly become a victim of its own success? To understand how this crisis began, we have to leave California and travel back to the coast of Thailand. The name Sriracha comes from Si Racha, a seaside town where fishermen and families developed chili sauces to serve with seafood. These early sauces were not identical to the thick, bright red version that would later become famous in America. They were often thinner, more fermented, more acidic, and balanced with garlic, sugar, salt, and vinegar. Their purpose was practical: to preserve fresh chilies, sharpen simple meals, and create a condiment that could survive in a hot coastal climate. Yet the exact origin remains disputed. Different families and companies have claimed links to the earliest recipes, and no single inventor can be confirmed with certainty. That ambiguity is important, because Sriracha did not begin as one protected formula. It began as a regional idea, flexible enough to be copied, adapted, and eventually carried far beyond Thailand. Sriracha did not move through Southeast Asia as one fixed recipe, passed neatly from country to country. Thailand, Vietnam, and neighboring regions already possessed their own traditions of grinding, fermenting, sweetening, and preserving chilies. In Vietnam, cooks produced various chili pastes and sauces using fresh peppers, garlic, vinegar, salt, and sugar, adapting them to local ingredients and dishes. These products were related to Sriracha through a shared regional food culture, but they were not necessarily copied from one original Thai formula. That distinction matters because David Tran's later sauce emerged from Vietnamese chili-making experience, while borrowing a name associated with the Thai town of Si Racha. What eventually appeared in California was therefore neither a preserved Thai recipe nor simply a traditional Vietnamese sauce. It was a new combination, shaped by several culinary traditions. Long before Sriracha became a global product, its identity had already been built through parallel invention, cultural exchange, and constant adaptation. For David Tran, that flexibility would become inseparable from survival. He had begun making chili sauces in Vietnam during the 1970s, using peppers grown by his family and selling them in reused glass bottles. But after the war, growing political pressure and uncertainty pushed him to leave the country. In late 1978, he boarded a freighter crowded with refugees and eventually reached Hong Kong. The ship's name, Huy Fong, would later become the name of his company. After receiving asylum in the United States, Tran first arrived in Boston, then moved to Los Angeles, where a growing Vietnamese and Chinese community was rebuilding familiar food traditions far from home. He did not arrive with a global brand, a marketing department, or a plan to conquer American kitchens. He arrived with a recipe, practical experience, and a simple observation. Immigrant restaurants needed a hot sauce that tasted like the food they remembered. In 1980, Tran opened Huy Fong Foods inside a modest 5,000-square-foot building near Los Angeles' Chinatown. Production was still small and intensely physical. Chilies were ground into sauce, containers were filled and labeled, and orders were delivered directly to local Asian restaurants from the back of a blue Chevrolet van. There were no supermarket contracts waiting for him, and no investors financing rapid expansion. Tran's first customers were restaurant owners who needed something hotter and fresher than the sauces available through mainstream distributors. Because he sold directly to them, he could hear what they liked and adjust the product without passing through corporate testing or advertising agencies. The business grew one kitchen at a time. Each bottle placed on a restaurant table introduced the sauce to another group of diners, many of whom had never heard the word Sriracha. A refugee's solution to a local problem was quietly becoming the foundation of an American food empire. As demand increased, Huy Fong's bottle became almost as important as the sauce inside it. The clear plastic revealed the vivid red mixture, while the green cap made it instantly recognizable from across a restaurant table. A white rooster appeared on the label because Tran had been born in the Chinese year of the rooster. Around it were words printed in several languages, reflecting the immigrant communities the company first served. The design was practical rather than luxurious, but that simplicity became its identity. Huy Fong spent little on traditional advertising and did not rely on celebrity endorsements or expensive television campaigns. Instead, the bottle remained visible wherever people ate. Customers squeezed it over noodles, rice, soups, eggs, and grilled meat, then introduced it to friends. The company did not manufacture a fashionable image. Repetition did. The more ordinary the bottle became inside Asian restaurants, the more extraordinary its reach began to look. By the 1990s and 2000s, Sriracha was escaping the restaurants that had first introduced it. Chefs began using it in marinades, mayonnaise, soups, burgers, tacos, and dishes that had no connection to Southeast Asia. College students kept bottles in dorm rooms because the sauce was inexpensive and could make simple food taste more exciting. Food writers praised its balance of heat, garlic, sweetness, and acidity, while online recipes transformed it into a cultural obsession. Soon, major companies were releasing Sriracha-flavored snacks, sauces, and fast food products. Yet Huy Fong had not created this expansion through a carefully managed campaign. The public had adopted the bottle and reinvented its purpose. Its greatest commercial advantage was not extreme heat, but adaptability. Sriracha could enter almost any cuisine without completely overpowering it. The sauce had crossed from immigrant tables into mainstream America, and its identity was becoming larger than the company itself. Success eventually forced Huy Fong to build on a much larger scale. The company moved into a vast factory in Irwindale, California, where millions of pounds of fresh chilies could be crushed during the harvest season. But the expansion created an unexpected threat. In 2013, nearby residents complained that the airborne chili fumes caused burning eyes, coughing, and headaches. The city sued, and a judge ordered the company to stop the operations responsible for the odors. For a company built on processing fresh peppers quickly, any interruption during harvest could have damaged an entire year of production. News reports warned of a possible Sriracha apocalypse, and fans rushed to buy bottles before supplies disappeared. The dispute was eventually resolved without closing the factory. But it exposed a new reality. The same production system that had made Sriracha successful could also become its greatest vulnerability. Behind every bottle was an agricultural system most customers never saw. Beginning in 1988, Huy Fong worked with Underwood Ranches, a California farming company that gradually became its most important pepper supplier. As Sriracha sales increased, Underwood expanded its fields, equipment, and workforce to meet the company's demand. By the mid-2000s, the farm was growing about 95% of Huy Fong's peppers, and later acquired more land to support further expansion. This relationship worked because both sides depended on precise timing. The jalapeños had to remain on the plant until they turned fully red, then be harvested and transported quickly before their quality declined. Huy Fong gained a steady supply of fresh peppers, while Underwood gained a customer large enough to transform its business. For nearly 3 decades, trust replaced many of the protections normally provided by detailed written contracts. The system appeared remarkably efficient, but efficiency built on dependence can become extremely dangerous when trust collapses. In 2016, that long partnership suddenly broke apart. Huy Fong accused Underwood Ranches of owing money from advance payments made for future pepper crops, while Underwood argued that the company had destroyed the relationship without proper warning. The disagreement quickly moved from private negotiations into court. After years of litigation, a jury concluded that Huy Fong had breached its agreement and acted fraudulently, awarding Underwood millions of dollars in damages. But the financial judgment was only one consequence. Huy Fong had lost the farming network that had supplied most of its peppers for nearly 3 decades, while Underwood was left with expanded land, machinery, and workers built around a customer that was suddenly gone. Both businesses survived, but the system connecting them did not. Huy Fong now had to rebuild its pepper supply across new farms and regions. The recipe remained unchanged, yet the dependable agricultural foundation beneath it had disappeared. After losing its longtime supplier, Huy Fong began sourcing peppers from farms across Mexico and the American Southwest. That wider network appeared to reduce dependence on a single grower, but it introduced a different weakness. The company now relied on regions facing intense heat, drought, and unpredictable harvests. Beginning in 2020, Huy Fong reported repeated shortages of suitable red jalapeños. By 2022, the problem had become severe enough to halt production of Sriracha, chili garlic, and sambal oelek. The company blamed weather conditions that had damaged both the quantity and quality of its peppers. Yet climate was not the only cause. The loss of Underwood's established fields had already removed a stable supply system built over decades. Bad weather struck a business that had made itself more vulnerable years earlier. When bottles disappeared from stores, customers saw an environmental crisis. Beneath it was also the delayed cost of a broken partnership. The shortage transformed an ordinary condiment into a symbol of scarcity. Supermarket shelves emptied, restaurants guarded their remaining bottles, and online sellers offered Sriracha at prices that once would have seemed absurd. But the crisis did more than frustrate loyal customers. It opened valuable shelf space for competitors. Thai producers, major American food companies, supermarket labels, and smaller sauce makers expanded their presence, while Huy Fong struggled to maintain production. Even Underwood Ranches entered the market with a sauce made from peppers grown on land that had once supplied the rooster bottle. For the first time, Many consumers were forced to compare alternatives rather than automatically reaching for Huy Fong. Some waited for the original, others discovered substitutes they preferred. Every month of unreliable supply therefore weakened something more valuable than sales: the assumption that Sriracha and Huy Fong were the same thing. That assumption had always rested on a legal and cultural misunderstanding. Huy Fong owned its rooster logo, distinctive packaging, and recognizable visual identity, but it did not own the word Sriracha. The name came from the Thai coastal town of Si Racha and had described a style of chili sauce long before David Tran's bottle dominated American restaurants. Competitors could therefore use the same word while offering entirely different recipes. For decades, this limitation barely mattered, because Huy Fong's version was so familiar that many American consumers treated it as the standard. The shortages changed that balance. Once other bottles appeared in the space left behind, the name no longer directed customers toward only one company. Huy Fong had created enormous commercial value around a word it could not fully control. Its success had made Sriracha famous, but fame had turned the name into shared territory. The production crisis did not end when the most severe shortages began to ease. In 2024, Huy Fong paused production again because the available jalapeños had not developed the deep red color required for its familiar sauce. That interruption revealed a weakness that extends beyond any single harvest. The company cannot simply replace its peppers with any chili of similar heat. Color, maturity, freshness, flavor, and timing all shape the product customers expect. Meanwhile, repeated shortages have reshaped the market around the rooster bottle. Retailers filled the empty shelf space with alternatives. Distributors developed relationships with competing producers, and consumers became more willing to try different brands. Huy Fong may remain one of the most recognizable names in the category, but recognition alone cannot guarantee dominance. The deeper problem is structural. The brand appears stable, while the agricultural system supporting it remains exposed to weather, harvest quality, and fragile supply relationships. As consumers encountered more alternatives, the shortage revived a deeper question: what should Sriracha actually taste like? Traditional Thai versions are often thinner, sweeter, and more acidic, designed especially for seafood and fried dishes. Huy Fong's version is thicker, more garlicky, and centered on fresh red jalapeños. Other producers emphasize fermentation, smoke, stronger heat, different chilies, or regional ingredients. These differences are not merely attempts to imitate one original recipe. They reflect the fact that Sriracha has never been governed by a universal formula. The name describes a family of sauces rather than a single fixed taste. Huy Fong may remain the version most familiar to many American consumers. But familiarity is not the same as historical ownership or authenticity. The shortages did not create Sriracha's diversity. They simply forced the public to notice that it had always existed. The future of the rooster bottle will depend less on inventing another flavor than on rebuilding resilience around the original one. Red jalapeños are not interchangeable factory inputs. They must reach the correct maturity, color, heat, and freshness within a narrow harvest window. Buying from several regions may spread risk, but it cannot eliminate drought, extreme heat, water shortages, or inconsistent quality across farms. Possible ways to reduce that risk would include dependable long-term relationships with growers, better crop forecasting, diversified production areas, and research into peppers capable of tolerating harsher conditions. None of these solutions is simple. Farmers need predictable orders before committing land and equipment, while Huy Fong needs flexibility when weather destroys a crop. The company's central challenge is therefore no longer merely producing enough sauce. It is rebuilding trust and agricultural stability without sacrificing the flavor that made the bottle famous. For the growers behind Sriracha, the risk begins long before a bottle reaches the factory. Farmers must decide how much land to dedicate to red jalapeños, months before knowing whether weather, water, labor, or contracts will remain favorable. The peppers require irrigation, field crews, machinery, and careful timing, yet they earn their value only if they reach the required color and quality during a narrow harvest period. A crop harvested too early may be too green. One left too long may soften or spoil before processing. If a buyer reduces an order or rejects the peppers, the farmer may be left with land and equipment dedicated to a crop that has limited alternative buyers at the same scale and within the same harvest window. The factory faces the opposite pressure. It needs enormous volumes, delivered quickly and consistently. Modern Sriracha production therefore depends on more than growing chilies. It depends on coordinating farms, workers, transport, processing capacity, and trust before the harvest window closes. In my view, the most impressive part of Sriracha's story is not that David Tran created a successful sauce. It is that he transformed the taste of displacement into something millions of people could recognize as their own. He began by serving immigrant communities that mainstream food companies largely ignored, yet the product eventually entered kitchens far beyond those communities. That achievement deserves admiration, but the later crises also complicate the usual story of the lone entrepreneur. No food empire is built by one person alone. It depends on farmers, workers, land, water, transportation, business relationships, and public trust. When those foundations are weakened, even the strongest brand can become fragile. Sriracha, therefore, represents both the power and the danger of modern food production. A simple idea can travel across the world, but success at that scale creates dependencies that no recipe, logo, or loyal customer base can completely control. The most important question is no longer whether Sriracha as a category will survive. Too many producers, cuisines, and consumers have adopted the idea for it to depend on a single company. The real question is, what place Huy Fong will hold inside the market it helped create? The Rooster bottle still carries enormous cultural recognition, but competitors now offer different flavors, sourcing systems, and relationships with growers. Consumers who once treated Huy Fong as the only authentic choice have learned that Sriracha can exist in many forms. That shift may strengthen the category, even as it weakens the dominance of its most famous producer. The sauce began as a regional idea, crossed borders through migration, and became a platform that companies and cultures could continually reinterpret. Its future will therefore be more diverse and less controllable than its past. The bottle may remain iconic, but the world around it no longer belongs to one brand. The empty shelves of 2022 no longer look like a temporary inconvenience. They reveal the entire history hidden inside one plastic bottle. Sriracha began as a coastal style of chili sauce in Thailand, was reimagined through Vietnamese migration, and became an American icon through restaurants, farmers, factories, and millions of ordinary meals. Its success came from adaptability, but that same adaptability allowed the name to escape the company that made it famous. Its scale created power, but also dependence on fragile crops, unpredictable weather, and relationships that could collapse. Even when the Rooster bottle sits on the shelf looking unchanged, the system behind it is no longer invisible. The next time you squeeze Sriracha onto a bowl of noodles or a slice of pizza, remember that you are not tasting only chili and garlic. You are tasting migration, ambition, conflict, climate, and a product that became larger than its creator.